in the world? What kind of citizen is he or she who abstains from, maybe even rejects, the harsh necessities, requirements of political life? Socrates seems to be, in some respects, an example of what Hegel in the 19th century described as a beautiful soul. You know, someone who, and he used that term ironically, I should say, someone who puts their own private moral incorruptibility above all else. And we all probably know or have read about people like this. How does Socrates answer these charges? He in a way, being not just an abstainer, but again, putting his own private moral conscience or integrity over and above the law. And he tries to defend his point of view by arguing in a famous passage that his policy of abstinence actually carries important benefits to the city. He brings with it important benefits. And in the passage that I'm referring to, he defines himself as a gadfly. Everyone will remember that. The gadfly who improves the quality of life in the city. In section 30d, Socrates writes, let me read the passage. "So I, men of Athens, are now too far from making a defense speech on my own behalf. I do it rather," he says, "on your behalf. What I say for you," he appears to say, "so that you do not do something wrong concerning the gift of the God," referring to himself, "the gift of the God by voting to condemn me. For if you kill me," he continues, you will not easily discover another of my sort, who, even if it is rather ridiculous to say so, has simply been set upon the city by the God as though upon a great and well-born horse, who is rather sluggish because of his great size and needs to be awakened by some gadfly. Just so, in fact, the God seems to me to have set me upon the city as someone of this sort. I awaken and persuade and reproach each one of you, and I do not stop settling down everywhere upon you the whole day." So here we have the example of Socrates telling us, not only declaring himself to be the gift of the God who is brought for this, but that he's a great benefactor of the city, that his example of the man of individual moral conscience brings with it great, as it were, public benefits. It is not on his behalf, he tells the audience, but yours, his fellow citizens, that he does what he does. You may not like me, he says to the jury, but I am good for you. And furthermore, he claims in this, what can only be described as sort of quasi-religious language, that he has no choice in the matter. This is not something he has chosen to do. He is, as he says, a gift from the God. He has been commanded, he argues, to do this. "Men of Athens," he says, "I will obey the God rather than you. And as long as I breathe and am able to do so, I will certainly not stop philosophizing." He seems to envelop himself and his way of life with a kind of religious imagery, the Delphic oracle, the gift of the God image. He envelops his conception of citizenship within this religious language. And this will or should lead any reader of the Apology and any reader of Plato to ask an important question about Socrates' use of this language. We will see it again in different ways in the Republic. Is he sincere in saying this, in making this point, or is he somehow being ironical in his use of the religious tone or the religious register? He is, after all, on trial for his life for the charge of impiety. Would it not seem that in order to rebut the charge of impiety, that he would use or adopt a kind of religious language that would resonate with the jury? and rebut the accusation, perhaps even suggesting that he is the truly religious and pious one, and not the ones like Anytus and Meletus who are bringing charges against him. Socrates seems, or could be seen to be speaking not just ironically, but provocatively in describing himself as a gift of the god. In a sense, you might ask, what could be more ludicrous? Socrates declaring himself, or anyone declaring themselves to be, a gift of the divine. But, right? I mean, who would make such a claim? But in another respect, he seems to take the divine calling very seriously, right? I mean, does he not? It was only when the Delphic oracle replied to Chaerephon, he tells that story, that it replied to him that no one was wiser than Socrates, that Socrates undertook this second sailing, as it were. His turn, we saw this last time, his turn away from the investigation of purely natural phenomena to the study of the world of moral virtue and justice. He repeatedly maintains that the path he has taken is not of his own choosing, but the result of a divine command. He is under some kind of divine edict. And it is precisely his devotion to this divine command, to this particular kind of calling, that has led him to neglect his worldly affairs. He reminds at various points the audience of his extreme poverty, his neglect of his family and his obligations to his wife and children, as well as to suffer the disgrace and the abuse that is directed against him by various public figures, he tells us. All of this is the result of his devotion to the divine command. He presents himself, in other words, as a human being of unparalleled piety and devotion who will risk life itself rather than quit the post that has been given to him. It's a very tall order that he claims for himself. Do we believe him in this respect? I mean, an important question. Do we believe him? Again, is he being sincere in this? Or is he using this, as it were, a kind of rhetoric with which to, envelop himself? What is this peculiar kind of piety that he claims to practice? In many ways, in replying to the jury's verdict and their request that he cease philosophizing, Socrates explains himself in the following terms. Let me just quote one other passage briefly from the second speech that he gives to the jury after his conviction. It is hardest of all to persuade you, to persuade some of you about this, he says, about his way of life. For if I say that this is to disobey the God, and because of this it is impossible to keep quiet, you will not be persuaded by me on the grounds that I am being ironic. And on the other hand, he says, if I say that this even happens to be a very great good for a human being, that is, to make speeches every day about virtue, and that the unexamined life is not worth living for a human being, you will still less be persuaded by me. In other words, what he seems to be saying in that passage at around 37 C and D is that he realizes he is on the horns of a dilemma. On the one hand, he says his reference to a divine mission, he explicitly says there, will be taken by his audience as being ironic, just another instance of Socratic irony and insincerity. But, he says, if he tries to persuade people of the goodness and the justice of his way of life on simply rational grounds alone, to persuade them that the examined life alone is worth living, he says he will not be believed. So what you might say is a Socratic citizen to do. He will either be accused of being ironic and not be believed, or he will simply be disbelieved if he attempts to defend himself on rational or philosophical grounds. That raises the question, I think, that I began the class with today. Should Socrates be tolerated? Would a good society tolerate Socrates? This is the question raised by this dialogue and the Crito as well. How far should freedom of speech, and that is to say speech that borders on or even verges into civic impiety, how far should such speech be tolerated? It's been an assumption of readers of Plato over the years that the trial of Socrates, that the execution of Socrates presents the case for the fullest liberty or freedom of thought and discussion, and the evils or the dangers to a society of trying to persecute or suppress freedom of speech. But is this right? In other words, is that really Plato's teaching? Among the things Socrates says he cares deeply about is his calling, as he puts it, to do nothing but persuade you, both younger and older, not to care for your bodies and money, but how your soul will be in the best possible condition. I think I lost my place. Yeah. So, let me just get back to that. How are we to understand this case about toleration and freedom of speech? The Apology presents Socrates, right, as presenting the most intransigent case for the philosopher as a radical critic or questioner of society. Socrates demands that the Athenians change not simply this or that aspect of their policy, but he demands nothing less than a drastic, I would even say